Before Putin, before Stalin, there was the original Russian nightmare. Ivan the Terrible, a man who turned paranoia into government policy and made Vlad the Impaler look like a kindergarten teacher with a timeout chair. Part visionary genius, part homicidal maniac, Ivan personally tortured thousands, created Russia's first secret police, and accidentally killed his own son in a fit of rage. Even 500 years later, historians still can't decide if he was Russia's greatest leader or its worst monster. Spoiler alert, he was both. Ready to discover how terrible can really get? The good news is Ivan IV of Russia was called the Terrible due to a translation quirk. The Russian word grozny actually means formidable or fearsome. The bad news is this linguistic tidbit didn't make him any less of a homicidal maniac with a crown. If formidable meant guy who'd have your eyeballs on a necklace for looking at him funny, then sure, let's go with formidable. History's full of rulers with cute nicknames that downplay their hobbies of torture and murder. Ivan wasn't collecting stamps in his spare time. He was collecting the screams of his enemies in what I can only imagine was medieval Russia's version of a mixtape. Born in 1530, little Ivan had what therapists today would call a lot to unpack. His dad died when he was 3, his mom was poisoned when he was 8, and then he was raised by boyars, Russian nobles, who apparently thought the best childcare strategy was neglect sprinkled with psychological torture. Picture being raised by a committee of Game of Thrones characters, but with worse hygiene and fewer dragons. By age 13, Ivan had developed such a healthy and normal response to his upbringing that he had his first person murdered, specifically the leader of the boyars. Nothing says, I'm working through my childhood trauma constructively, like feeding someone to dogs. And they say Gen Z has problems with conflict resolution. Ivan crowned himself the first Tsar of all Russia at 16, which is the age when most of us were still trying to figure out how to talk to our crush without having a panic attack. While today's teenagers stress about college applications, Ivan was redesigning the entire Russian governmental structure and conquering neighboring territories. Talk about overachiever anxiety. He created the Streltsy, Russia's first standing army, established the Zemsky Sobor, an early parliament, and implemented the Sudebnik legal code. It's like if that insufferable kid from your high school who was class president, valedictorian, and star quarterback also happened to execute people who disagreed with his lunch table policies. In his early reign, Ivan was actually somewhat reasonable, if you can believe it. He expanded Russia's territory, reformed the law, limited the power of the boyars. Can't imagine why he had it out for them, and even established diplomatic relations with England. Queen Elizabeth I and Ivan actually had a weird pen pal thing going, and he even proposed marriage to her at one point. Imagine that Tinder match. Elizabeth, 25, enjoys poetry and naval domination. Ivan, 30, enjoys long walks on the beach, impaling enemies, and is looking for a queen who doesn't mind occasional homicidal rages. Swiping right on that would have changed history in ways we can't even begin to comprehend. The ultimate Anglo-Russian power couple that never was. But around 1558, Ivan decided to invade Livonia, modern-day Estonia and Latvia, kicking off the Livonian War that would last for 25 years and basically accomplish nothing except draining Russia's resources and making a lot of people dead. This is pretty much how most wars go. Some guy with too much power and too little impulse control decides another piece of land should be his, and then thousands of people who couldn't care less about the whole thing die horrible deaths. The 16th century equivalent of "my dad can beat up your dad" played out with armies instead of playground boasting. If only they'd had fantasy football to channel all that competitive energy, history might have been a lot less bloody. Then came 1560, when Ivan's beloved first wife, Anastasia, died. Now, most people process grief through things like therapy, support groups, or drowning their sorrows in ice cream while watching sad movies. Ivan processed grief by becoming exponentially more paranoid and violent, convinced his wife had been poisoned by, you guessed it, those pesky boyars again. This is where we start to see Ivan transition from harsh but effective ruler with some anger issues to completely unhinged tyrant who makes Joffrey Baratheon look like Mr. Rogers. It's like watching someone go from takes up 2 parking spaces sometimes to collects human teeth and talks to them at night, on the spectrum of concerning behavior. And folks, we're just getting started with Ivan's terrible, horrible, no good, very bad reign of terror. Tentar Novum Nef. Ivan's grief-fueled paranoia led to what historians delicately call his period of personal rule, which is like calling a hurricane a period of enthusiastic wind. In 1564, he did what any rational person would do after a personal tragedy. He packed up his valuables, took his family, and dramatically stormed out of Moscow, leaving a letter accusing the boyars and clergy of treason. It was essentially the 16th century equivalent of posting a vague, "I can't deal with this anymore. You all know what you did" status, and then ignoring comments asking if you're okay. Surprisingly, the Muscovites begged him to return instead of celebrating with the tyrant is gone parties, proving that Stockholm Syndrome worked just as well before Stockholm was even relevant. When Ivan graciously agreed to return to power, he came with a catch bigger than the fine print on a payday loan: the creation of the Oprichnina. This was essentially Ivan saying, "I'm dividing Russia in two, one part for regular government, and one part that's my personal playground where I can do whatever I want." The regular territory, Zemshchina, continued to be administered by the boyars, while the Oprichnina became Ivan's personal terrorscape, where his new gang of black-clad thugs called Oprichniki could rampage at will. These delightful fellows rode around on black horses, with dog heads and brooms attached to their saddles, symbolizing their mission to hunt down and sweep away treason, basically serving as the world's most macabre cleaning service. The Oprichniki weren't your average royal guards. They were more like a death cult with government benefits, dressed all in black like medieval goths who discovered murder instead of poetry. They swore absolute loyalty to Ivan and took a vow of silence about their activities. They were essentially the first rule of Fight Club, except instead of fighting each other, they terrorized anyone Ivan pointed at. These cheerful chaps had a license to kill, torture, rape, and confiscate property without consequence. Imagine combining the worst aspects of the KGB, IRS, and a motorcycle gang, then giving them religious authority. That's the Oprichniki, and they made Ivan's reign not just terrible, but absolutely horrific for anyone unlucky enough to be suspected of, well, anything. The pinnacle of Ivan's paranoid cruelty came in 1570, when he became convinced that the city of Novgorod was planning to defect to Poland-Lithuania. Now, was there actual evidence of this treachery? About as much evidence as there is for flat earth theory. But that didn't stop Ivan from leading his Oprichniki on a 5-week orgy of violence that reduced one of Russia's most prosperous cities to a shell of its former self. Contemporary accounts claim that up to 60,000 people were killed, though modern historians put the number closer to 2,000 to 3,000, which, is still thousands of people murdered on a hunch. The Oprichniki would round up families daily and subject them to elaborate torture before drowning them in the Fokhov River, which became so clogged with corpses that it reportedly changed course. Talk about environmental impact. Ivan's methods of dealing with perceived enemies would make modern dictators take notes, while simultaneously feeling a bit queasy. He pioneered creative punishment techniques like boiling people alive, impaling them, skinning them, or employing my personal favorite for sheer medieval ingenuity, strapping a person to 2 bent-over trees, then releasing the trees to rip the poor soul in half. It's like a Stretch Armstrong toy, but with real people and much more screaming. Ivan was reportedly fond of watching these executions while eating, which really puts your habit of watching true crime documentaries during dinner in perspective. He also enjoyed forcing relatives to watch their family members being tortured, which is slightly worse than making your relatives watch your vacation slideshow, though some might debate that. While Ivan was busy setting new standards for governmental sadism, his personal life wasn't exactly a model of stability either. He managed to go through 8 wives in total, which is impressive considering that the Orthodox Church only permitted 3 marriages, and divorcing a czar typically involved a one-way ticket to a convent. Several of his wives died mysteriously, leading to speculation about poisoning. Though given Ivan's personality, it's equally possible they died of stress from being married to a homicidal maniac. Imagine bringing home the wrong type of bread and wondering if today's the day you get fed to the dogs. Marriage to Ivan was essentially a deadly game show where the prize for winning was getting to live another day with Ivan, which hardly seems worth the effort of competing. Ivan's reign of terror reached its most personal tragedy in 1581, when he committed what was arguably his worst act. And given his resume, that's saying something. During an argument, Ivan struck his pregnant daughter-in-law, causing a miscarriage. When his son Ivan Jr. confronted him about this, imagine the courage it took to say, "Dad, not cool," to history's most notorious tyrant. Ivan responded by striking his son in the head with a scepter. Nothing says Father of the Year like bludgeoning your own heir to death with a symbolic rod of royal authority. The Tsar immediately regretted this action, reportedly throwing himself on his son's body and crying, "I've killed my son. I've killed my son," which was a stunningly accurate assessment of the situation. This family drama makes the Kardashians look like the Brady Bunch by comparison, with his competent heir now occupying a coffin instead of preparing to rule. Ivan's succession plan was in shambles. His surviving son, Fifer, was described by contemporaries as kind and pious, which in 16th century royal circles was code for completely unsuited to govern a massive empire surrounded by enemies. Modern historians suggest Fifer may have had developmental disabilities, though it's equally possible he just seemed slow in comparison to his hyperactive, murder enthusiast father. Either way, Ivan had effectively guaranteed that his legacy would crumble shortly after his death. It's like spending decades building an elaborate sandcastle and then personally kicking it down just before the tide could do it for you. Ivan's mental state continued its rapid decline in his final years. He became obsessed with death, bringing in soothsayers to predict when he would die. A dangerous job, if ever there was one. Guess wrong, and you might not live to make another prediction. He alternated between extreme religious devotion, donating generously to monasteries and praying for hours, and extreme depravity that would make a modern rock star blush. This spiritual whiplash was likely unpleasant for everyone at court, as they never knew if they'd encounter Ivan the Penitent or Ivan the Perverted on any given day. Imagine your boss showing up either as a monk in sackcloth or as someone who just stepped out on a Motley Crue tour bus. And you've got the general idea of the workplace environment. The Tsar's health was deteriorating rapidly by 1584, likely due to mercury poisoning. Ivan, like many nobles of his time, was a big fan of mercury as a medicine, which is roughly equivalent to using gasoline as a sports drink. Contemporary accounts suggest he suffered from joint pain, digestive issues, and dramatic mood swings, all consistent with mercury poisoning. His body was literally becoming as toxic as his personality. Modern analysis of his remains found mercury levels almost 130 times higher than normal. Between that and his fondness for alcohol and opium, it's amazing he functioned long enough to be such a prolific murderer. It's the 16th century version of the Florida Man headlines. Mercury-addled monarch massacres more Muscovites. Maintains mystifyingly massive empire. Despite being a paranoid, murderous despot, Ivan was also, and this is the truly infuriating part for historians, an incredibly intelligent man. He maintained one of Europe's largest personal libraries, wrote theological tracts and poetry, composed music, and was an accomplished chess player. He spoke several languages and corresponded with leaders across Europe. It's like finding out that Darth Vader also ran a successful charity for orphans in his spare time. Ivan's legacy is complicated by the fact that alongside his reign of terror, he modernized Russia's legal code, expanded its territory, established its first printing press, and reformed its administrative structure. He was essentially rebuilding the entire Russian governmental system with one hand while dismantling social trust and murdering innocents with the other. On March 18th, 1584, Ivan was reportedly setting up a chess match when he collapsed. Some accounts claim he was mid-move when death finally checkmated the aging Tsar. His final hours were spent, fittingly enough, engaged in a game of strategy, while his body surrendered to the toxic elements he had willingly consumed for years. The irony of a man who had spent decades outmaneuvering his enemies being ultimately defeated by his own medical choices would not have been lost on Ivan, who had a keen sense of the dramatic. As he lay dying, Ivan reportedly took monastic vows and adopted the name Jonah, because nothing says sincere repentance like a deathbed career change after decades of enthusiastic sin. With his final breath, Russia's most terrible ruler ended his 37-year reign of innovation and atrocity, leaving behind a transformed country that breathed a collective sigh of relief. Ivan's death sparked what Russians call the Time of Troubles, a period that makes Game of Thrones look like a particularly tame episode of Sesame Street. I inherited the throne, but was essentially a puppet for his brother-in-law, Boris Godunov. Imagine being the ruler of one of history's largest empires, but having all the actual authority of a mall security guard. That was Fifer's situation. The real power behind the throne, Godunov, did a decent job of maintaining stability until Fifer died childless in 1598, ending the 700-year Ruhr dynasty that had ruled Russia since before indoor plumbing was popular. This dynastic extinction was Ivan's final gift to Russia, centuries of stability obliterated because he couldn't control his temper around his son. The decades following Ivan's death saw pretenders, Polish invasions, peasant uprisings, and widespread famine. It's almost as if establishing a precedent where the government routinely tortures and murders its citizens leads to some sort of breakdown in the social contract. Who could have possibly predicted such an outcome? The time of troubles only ended when the Romanov dynasty took power in 1613, establishing a royal family that would rule Russia until 1917. That's right. The aftershocks of Ivan's reign were so significant that you can draw a direct line from his behavior to the conditions that eventually produced the Russian Revolution. Talk about a long-term impact statement on your royal resume. But what about Ivan's notorious legacy? History has been surprisingly kind to him in Russia itself. While Western accounts focus predominantly on his cruelty, because apparently mass murder tends to overshadow administrative reforms in most historical narratives, Russian historiography has often portrayed him as a harsh but necessary ruler who strengthened the state. Under Stalin, another leader not known for his gentle touch, Ivan was rehabilitated as a great state builder who justifiably punished treasonous nobles. Stalin reportedly watched Sergei Eisenstein's film, Ivan the Terrible, multiple times, nodding approvingly at the portrayal of mass executions. When your biggest fan is Joseph Stalin, perhaps it's time to reconsider your personal brand. Modern Russians have a similarly complicated relationship with Ivan's memory. In 2016, Russia erected a statue of Ivan in Oryol, the first major monument to the controversial Tsar. The statue originally included his murdered son at his feet, but after public outcry, designers modified it to show just Ivan, looking regal and decidedly unterrible. It's like commemorating Hannibal Lecter, but focusing exclusively on his excellent taste in wine and classical music. The monument sparked heated debate about whether Russia should celebrate a figure who combines state building with sadistic excess. This ambivalence reflects the broader question many societies face. How do we reckon with historical figures who did both significant good and horrifying evil? Ivan's impact on Russian political culture remains profound even today. He centralized power in the hands of a single strong ruler, created a secret police force that operated above the law, and established a tradition of state terror as a governance tool. Sound vaguely familiar? Scholars have noted the continuity between Ivan's Oprichniki and the Soviet KGB or today's FSB, suggesting that his governance model created a template that Russian leaders have returned to repeatedly over the centuries. Putin's Russia, with its strong executive, nationalist rhetoric, and intolerance of dissent, would be recognizable to Ivan, though he might find the lack of public executions disappointingly restrained. The iron fist and the velvet glove has become somewhat more velvet and less iron, but the basic approach remains. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Ivan's terrible legacy is how thoroughly he transformed Russia in ways that persist half a millennium later. He shifted Russia's orientation toward Europe, expanded its territory into Siberia, setting the stage for Russia becoming the world's largest country, established diplomatic relations with Western powers, and created governmental structures that would endure for centuries. All this while also finding time to murder thousands of his subjects in creative ways. It's a bit like acknowledging that the architect who designed your beautiful house also had a habit of occasionally setting the bedrooms on fire with people still sleeping in them. The magnificent achievement cannot be separated from the monstrous behavior, leaving historians in the uncomfortable position of acknowledging that terrible people can make lasting, and sometimes even positive, contributions to human civilization. The legacy of Ivan the Terrible offers a fascinating case study in how societies mythologize their monsters. In Russia today, Ivan exists in a strange liminal space between villain and hero, condemned for his excesses but admired for his strength. It's like how Americans might view someone like Steve Jobs. Sure, he was by many accounts a terrible person to work for, but hey, look at these shiny iPhones. Except instead of demanding impossible product deadlines, Ivan demanded people's heads on Pike's minor difference. This historical ambivalence speaks to a universal human tendency to forgive almost anything in leaders if they're perceived as having advanced national interests. Proving that he made the trains run on time remains the world's most versatile excuse for authoritarianism. What would Ivan make of modern Russia? He'd likely approve of its strong central authority, but might be puzzled by the relative lack of public torture spectacles. You mean you just poison your enemies or throw them out windows? Where's the theatrical flair in that? He might ask while setting up another impalement. The psychological warfare of today, disinformation campaigns, election interference, cyber attacks, would probably impress Ivan as being more efficient than his methods, though perhaps lacking the visceral satisfaction of watching your enemies being torn apart by horses. Even the most hardened modern FSB agent might blanch at Ivan's preferred methods of dealing with opposition, which makes you wonder if we've really progressed as a species or just outsourced our cruelty to more palatable mechanisms. The historical lessons from Ivan's reign feel depressingly relevant in our era of resurging authoritarianism. His playbook: create external enemies, establish personal loyalty as the highest virtue, punish dissent mercilessly, control information flow, reads like a how-to manual for aspiring dictators throughout the centuries. The Oprechnicki's black outfits and insignia were essentially the world's first fascist uniforms, complete with a cult-like devotion to their leader. Ivan understood what modern psychological research has confirmed. Fear is a powerful motivator, and demonstrative cruelty against a few can control the behavior of many. The next time you see a modern dictator staging an elaborate show trial or public punishment, know that they're following a script written in blood by Ivan and perfected over centuries of authoritarian rule. Ivan's reign also demonstrates the devastating long-term consequences of unchecked power. After his death, Russia plunged into the time of troubles partly because he had systematically eliminated everyone with the experience and ability to govern effectively. It turns out that murdering your most talented advisors and officials, because they might possibly, maybe someday consider opposing you, is not a sustainable management strategy. Who knew? This pattern has repeated throughout history. Regimes built on fear and personal loyalty typically collapse into chaos once the central figure disappears. The same loyalty that seems so valuable during a ruler's lifetime becomes catastrophically destructive when succession time arrives. It's like building a house entirely around a single supporting column, then being surprised when removing that column causes everything to collapse. For all his brutality, Ivan was also a man profoundly shaped by trauma and mental illness, operating in an era with no concept of either. Orphaned young, betrayed repeatedly, and raised in a culture that equated strength with violence, Ivan developed paranoia and sadistic tendencies that would today have mental health professionals reaching for the strongest medications in their arsenal. His mercury poisoning likely exacerbated these conditions, creating a perfect storm of psychological disturbance and neurotoxicity. This doesn't excuse his actions, but does contextualize them within the brutal reality of medieval power politics. In an era where mad kings were common across Europe, Ivan stands out not necessarily for being more mentally unstable than his contemporaries, but for having more absolute power with which to express that instability. So what's the final verdict on history's most terrible Ivan? Was he a visionary state builder or a sadistic monster? The uncomfortable answer is both. Human beings have a desperate desire to categorize historical figures as heroes or villains, but the most consequential people typically defy such simple classifications. Ivan expanded Russia's territory, reformed its legal system, established international diplomatic relations, and laid the groundwork for Russia's emergence as a European power. He also skinned people alive for fun and created a state terror apparatus that would inspire secret police forces for centuries to come. To understand Ivan is to acknowledge that humans are capable of both remarkable achievement and horrifying cruelty, often simultaneously and without any sense of contradiction. In the end, perhaps it's the most terrible truth of all, that monsters don't always look like monsters, and that the line between greatness and terribleness is thinner than we'd like to admit. After all, if history has taught us anything, it's that one person's terrible ruler is another person's national hero, though preferably one you admire from the safe distance of several centuries. So the next time you complain about your terrible boss or terrible president, take a moment to appreciate that at least they probably don't have a personal torture chamber or a custom-made scepter for bludgeoning their relatives. The bar for terrible leadership has been significantly lowered since Ivan's day, which is perhaps the only real progress humanity has made in 5 centuries of political evolution. And isn't that a terribly comforting thought?